I wanted to first begin by welcoming you on behalf of the Human Relations Commission. I'm pleased to be here to talk about this issue of living wage and begin this community dialogue. Before we begin, I'd just like to take a moment to thank our host, the Boulder Chamber of Commerce, and the sponsors for tonight's forum, the League of Women Voters. It's been so helpful, the Boulder Latino Chamber of Commerce, and of course the Human Relations Commission. I also want to thank and recognize the Planning Committee. Do you mind just standing if you were on the Planning Committee? Could you please stand and be recognized? We had a number of meetings. Thank you. And I'd also, in the interest of time, like to just ask our elected officials to stand and wave and be recognized as well. Thank you very much for the Human Relations Commission works to facilitate education and encourage awareness on a wide range of social issues. Our desire to sponsor this forum stems from our increasing concern about the risks and stressors to our neighbors who live in poverty and the working poor and struggling immigrants in our community. The iNews investigative report called Losing Ground, you might recall a couple of years ago, the Boulder County Latino Community Assessment, and the County Trends Report all called attention to growing disparity in income, disparity in education achievement, health outcomes, and I just read in the Daily Camera yesterday, apparently also disparity in eating habits. It seemed to the HRC that the efforts to further the City Council's goals around community sustainability and resiliency are at risk because of this growing disparity. And while the City Council's passage of a resolution in 2003 to ensure that all full-time standard city employees receive a living wage, the prohibition on local minimum wage and conversations about a federal minimum wage now at a standstill, and Boulder County being at the center of wealth inequality makes the time seem right to us now to revisit this matter of living wage policy. I wanted to introduce our moderator this evening, Eliberto Mendoza. Eliberto was born of migrant farm worker parents, and he grew up migrating with his family from the Rio Grande Valley of Texas and to Illinois. His family was able to break the cycle of migration by finding permanent employment in Texas, the kind of stability that lends itself to accomplishments of being, for example, the first to go to college in his family. His involvement with Intercambio and St. Vrain Valley Latino Coalition and the Latino Chamber, and current job as the interim director of the county CAPS programs, makes his involvement with this issue quite fitting. So please help me welcome Eliberto.
Thank you once again for being here with us tonight. Before I introduce our panel and another speaker, I'm going to just go over how this forum is going to operate, how the questions and comment period is going to work. So if you have a question for our panelists or others presenting here tonight, please write your questions on the index cards. We have ushers that have been passing those out. When you're done writing, just hold your card up silently and the usher will collect them from you. So questions will be sorted and checked for duplication by our question reviewers here at this table, and then handed to me for public reading during the question and comment period. If you prefer to pose your question or make a comment orally, you will have 1 minute to state your question or comment at the public mic, which will be at that podium in the back. There will be a mic there for you to use. Panelists will be given 2 minutes, 2-minute time limit to respond to questions that were directed at them. And if a question is meant for 2 panelists, we're going to up that to 3 minutes, so about 1.5 minutes each. And we do have timekeepers, so they will be letting us know. So if I cut you off, because the timekeeper has told me, you want to guys show your paddles so they can see? So you see that, and that means you're getting close to your end. We will get to as many questions and/or comments as possible tonight, but please understand that we may not get to all of them. Okay? So let me take some time to introduce some of our guest panelists. Let's start with Claire Levy. Claire Levy is the Executive Director of the Colorado Center on Law and Policy. CCLP is a nonprofit organization whose mission is advancing the health, economic security, and well-being of low-income Coloradans through research, advocacy, litigation, and education. Before taking this position, Claire served in the state legislature from 2007 to 2013, representing Grand, Jackson, Clear Creek, and Gilpin counties, as well as parts of Boulder County. Before her election to the state legislature, Claire practiced law, specializing in land use and local government law. She also served on several city and county boards and commissions, including the City of Boulder Planning Board and the Boulder County Housing Authority. Next to her is Jeffrey Zaks. Jeffrey is a professor specializing in labor economics, public economics, and urban economics at the University of Colorado Boulder. Among his published papers are articles on the relationship between IQ, schooling and adult income, the effects of residential segregation on black economic welfare, the economic consequences of competition among local governments, the estimation of voting behavior, and microeconomic activity in China. Additional themes in his current work include the measurement, causes, and effects of residential segregation and income inequality in the US and China. He has served as a consultant for many public and private organizations, including the Attorneys General of the states of Arkansas, Arizona, Colorado, Montana, and South Dakota. And finally, Don Grant. Don is currently the chair of CU Boulder's Department of Sociology and an affiliate of the Renewable and Sustainable Energy Institute. He conducts research on social inequality, climate change, and organizational culture. Prior to coming to CU Boulder in January, he was the professor of sociology at the University of Arizona for 22 years. Before we get to their presentations, I want to welcome up to the podium Wendy Boulder. She will be presenting a little bit on the Boulder County Trends Report that's put out by the Community Foundation. Wendy is the principal at Boulder's Barn Consulting, a consulting firm which specializes in advising mission-driven organizations on strategic planning, fundraising, program growth, and marketing. She is a partner of Social Venture Partners of Boulder, an active committee member and former leadership fellow for the Community Foundation serving Boulder County, and chairs a strategic planning committee for an international NGO called Prosperity Catalyst. Wendy.
Thank you. Hi everybody, thank you so much for having me here today. This is amazing to see a really full room here tonight. My name is Wendy Boulder, and I am, as Eliberto mentioned, a volunteer, and also have been brought on with the Community Foundation to share the news and the research that we have from this Trends publication. So I'm thrilled to be sharing it with you tonight. We have copies on several chairs. We have extras in the back. If you already have a copy of Trends at home, take one home for a neighbor, because we feel like this is really important information that we want folks in the county to know about. So that's why I'm here tonight, to share this with you. I'm going to do a couple of things tonight in a very short amount of time, just to give you a little taste of what's here in Trends. The first is I want to just introduce you to the Community Foundation. I'm sure many of you are quite aware of what the Community Foundation does, but I want to make sure no one leaves the room without some information about that. Talk specifically about Trends and what's in here, and then I'm going to get into the stuff that I know everybody here is really interested in, which is the demographics of our county and some of the economic indicators in our county. And that's when we'll go to the slides. So that's what I'm going to talk about in my short time. The Community Foundation, Inspired Giving, Informed Action here in Boulder County. The Community Foundation has been around since 1991. In that time, we have given away $55 million in grants to nonprofits all over the county. And in 2013, the number was $5.4 million in grant making. So a huge impact on the nonprofits here in our community. In addition to grant making, the Community Foundation sponsors leadership initiatives. They do a lot of advocacy. And then a big part of the work is research, like the information that we find here in Trends. And the relationship between all those, of course, is quite tight, because the research informs the grant making. It informs the leadership decisions that are made by the foundation and by the community at large. Then it informs the collaborative efforts that we all make when we bring our policy and nonprofit leaders together. This is actually the 8th Trends that Community Foundation has put out, and we will be starting in the next few months on the next edition. So be looking for that soon. Inside, you will find, and I really encourage you to flip through and see what else is in here. There are 100 indicators in trends, 100 different graphs and pieces of data in 8 different categories. So in addition to the economics that we're going to talk about tonight, we have education, we have the environment, demographics, health, arts, philanthropy, and civic engagement. So lots of great stuff in there. This data has been used in past years to really make some changes in our county. So among them are the prioritization that the Community Foundation has placed on the achievement gap. That was really based on the achievement numbers that trends turned out and the problems with the gap that we've seen here in our county. Also based on trends, the Community Foundation started the Leadership Fellows Program, which is a cohort of about 30 young leaders in the county, 50% of whom are people of color. Another example of how trends has really allowed the Community Foundation and our county to take action is with the Health Improvement Collaborative that came out of this research not too long ago, which has brought together many of the different health organizations in our county to improve health for all of us here in the county. So that is trends, and I want to go from there to introduce you to a few statistics and also a challenge for you tonight. I've shared how the Community Foundation has used Trends Magazine, and what we really hope is that all of you will use it as well. So dig in, find the research that you need, and use it to advocate for your causes, for living wage, for example, if that's what you're here to advocate for. And we really hope that this can be valuable to help you make your case. So that's your challenge for tonight. And with that, I want to do a little bit of question and answer here and see who's been doing their homework. Does anybody know about what the poverty line is in Boulder County?
25,000.
25,000. And if people have read their sheets, I noticed that this has been prepared for you too. And it's at the bottom of the sheet. So $25,000 a year for a family of 4. Okay? And I don't know about the rest of you, but I can see that really being a stretch, all right, in our county. But that's what we call the poverty line, and we have 14% of our county who are living at or below the poverty line. So that's my first surprise for tonight. Some of you may be aware of these numbers. For me, it's chilling every time I talk about it, honestly. That's 40,000 people here in Boulder below the poverty line. So we knew that we had some numbers there, but 40,000 is sure a lot more than I think any of us would anticipate or expect. Our median income here in Boulder is $90,000 for a family of 4 annually. So there's plenty of people who that's not a problem for. But the reality is that Colorado Fiscal Policy Institute has recommended that a true sort of base standard of living is probably more around $68,000 a year, okay? Which is just considerably more than obviously than 25,000. Okay, one more quiz and then we will move on to some slides. Any guesses on the median home price here in Boulder? Anybody want to throw out some numbers? What do you think it's going to cost?
400,000.
400,000? That would be good if you could get a house with it. 660? Yeah. So where we are is right in the middle there. 560,000 is the median home price in the city of Boulder. Now Longmont is much more reasonable and comes in at about $233,000 for a home in Longmont. So again, if you're thinking about $25,000 a year that you're making, it's going to take a while to save up for that down payment. Okay. So the way Trends is set up is we have sort of a good news, bad news dichotomy here. And that's what I'll be sharing with you. Assuming we can get some action on the slides. Here we go. Okay. So the good news is many of us here do very well. This is probably not news for any of us, okay? Family income distribution, as I mentioned, our median is about 90,000, right, which is considerably higher than the U.S. average. So that is great for those people, those families. It is great for our tax base, right? And it should be good for our nonprofits and for our philanthropic community, although there's a lot more to be said about that, which we'll have to table for another discussion. But you'll see that we have a very high percentage in this over 150,000. So plenty of money here in Boulder. That's the good news side. Okay, the not so good news is around this huge disparity we have in median household income by ethnicity. So this is a really depressing slide to me, right? This is embarrassing. This is not what we are proud to say about Boulder County. Our gap between what the average Latino family and the average Anglo family is making is huge, okay? Anglos are making 97% more than their neighbors here in Boulder County who are Latino. That gap certainly exists in the US at large, okay? So that's not a surprise. But the fact that our gap is so much larger, I think it's something we really should think about and be talking about. All right, let's go back to some good news. The good news is that we are almost back to 2008 levels in terms of these economic indicators and per capita personal income. Right, so finally, the US is trending up, Colorado's above that, and Boulder is nicely above that. So, phew, okay, we're coming back finally from 2008. And our expectation, of course, would be that rising tide rather, would lift all boats, right? We find instead that poverty is rising too, alongside rising incomes. So here in Boulder, we have more poverty in 2011, considerably more than we did in 2000. Particularly, and this is what's most concerning, of course, is with families with children, Latino children, and children under 5. So those categories are, again, friends and neighbors who are most at risk, are most threatened by the gap that we have in our county. And this is my last slide coming up right here. And this is talking about education. So one interesting way to slice this data is to look at median earnings by educational attainment. And what you see right here is this line right at high school graduation, where people who went to high school, whether or not they graduated, have slipped behind in terms of their income since 2006. Okay, they're making less. Happily, those people who have been able to go to college or go on to graduate school are making more, okay? So we at the Community Foundation feel like education is a really important investment and a way to make sure that people are on the plus side of this income change. And with that, I hand it over to the panelists and look forward to your questions.
I'm really going to start just by presenting some background information, kind of similar to what Wendy already presented for Boulder County, but mine will be a little more general and will mostly address the state of Colorado for information about the minimum wage, about poverty, and about self-sufficiency. So this slide shows some information about how wages have fared since the year 2000. And what it shows is that since 2000, which is before the recession of 2001, income of earners in the bottom 20% of the wage spectrum has fallen 8% in constant dollars. People in low-wage jobs are having a harder time making ends meet. They aren't sharing in the economic recovery that many of the rest of the people in Colorado and in the country are experiencing. And what you can also see here is that the top line, those in the top 20% of the earning spectrum, have seen their incomes rise over the same period of time by 12%. Oops, went too far. There we go. Another frequently cited condition that is endemic to the current economic picture is the fact that relative to productivity per worker, compensation has been stagnant. You can see there that before the mid-70s, productivity increased and compensation increased along with it, more or less in tandem. And so that created a condition of basically shared prosperity. Employees' fortunes were joined with those of their employees or employers. But what you can see now is that workers are no longer sharing in the financial gains that are generated by the increase in productivity. And that reflects a fundamental restructuring of income and profits in our economy. The benefits of more productivity are being seen by shareholders, but not by employees. So why isn't just establishing a minimum wage, which we have in Colorado by Constitution, why isn't that enough to assure a basic floor on income and the value of labor? Why are we talking about something else called a living wage? Well, this slide and I have another, and they both basically show the same thing. What they show is that using 2014 dollars, the minimum wage had a value of about $9.75 an hour back in 1978, which is basically the beginning of this slide. So what you see on the bottom is the nominal minimum wage, what it actually was in dollars at that time. And what you see on the top is the inflation-adjusted value of that. So back in the 70s, when the minimum wage was somewhere around $1.75, $2 an hour, in purchasing power, that was the equivalent of what you see on that top line. And you can see that it has eroded over time. Same as, this slide shows the same thing. You'll see where it's periodically adjusted upward, but then very quickly loses value as inflation eats away at what was just set. That nadir is where many of us celebrated, actually, that Colorado passed a constitutional amendment to raise the minimum wage and then have it adjusted based on the consumer price index. So it has gone up, but as you can see, it's nowhere near where it needs to be to even equal what it was back in 1978. So this is a slide that comes from one of the publications of the Colorado Center on Law and Policy called The State of Work in Colorado. And what this shows is just one of the major household expenses that is generally not considered when the poverty rate is calculated, and it's not included in calculating the consumer price index. This shows the cost of childcare in a center-based childcare facility relative to the income of various family compositions. And as you can see, for a single mother, it's consuming a significant portion of the median income of single mothers in Colorado. The cost of center-based childcare is basically around $10,000 a year. And if you're not considering that when you're thinking about a minimum wage or you're thinking about the poverty level, you're ignoring a huge, huge expense in a household budget. Living wages and public benefits are generally pegged to some percentage of the federal poverty level. This is a chart that shows you what that is for various household sizes. Interesting thing about the way the federal poverty level is established, it's based on household composition, 1, 2, 3, 4, etc., members of a household. What you'll see when you get to the self-sufficiency standard, which the Colorado Center on Law and Policy has published, is that it can vary, your household expenses vary drastically depending on the actual composition of your household. Do you have a toddler? Do you have an infant? Do you have a preschool age kid? Do you have an older kid? How many wage earners are there? So this is a very blunt, the federal poverty level is a very, very blunt measure of well-being of any sort. in this country. The other issue about the federal poverty level is that it doesn't vary. It's set across the country, and we have wide disparities in the cost of living from one place to another. Even in Colorado, we have vast disparities in the cost of living. So when we talk about the poverty level in Boulder County or in this country or in this nation, we're talking about a very, very low threshold that really is not a very accurate measure of economic well-being. So this slide, I don't know if you're able to read it, but I think portions of it were reproduced in some materials that were on your seat. This comes from the self-sufficiency standard, and I brought copies of the whole booklet for people in the back. And as you can see from this, and this is calculated in 2011, and inflation has been at about 6% cumulative between 2011 and 2014. So you can see from the self-sufficiency standard that the actual cost of meeting your household expenses, what is included there, you've got housing, childcare, food, transportation, healthcare, miscellaneous, which is a very modest allowance for necessities, really no luxuries, is vastly, vastly different when you get down to the bottom from the federal poverty level. If I can find my sheet here, let's see. In Boulder County, for one adult, the self-sufficiency standard would be $50,483, which is 343% of the federal poverty level. So, I mean, there's a very interesting comparison, and of course it only goes up from there. We think that looking at the cost of providing these essentials is a much better way of determining whether the wages that you're being paid are adequate. So the last slide that I have shows where the minimum wage falls relative to the federal poverty level and to the self-sufficiency standard. This slide is a little bit misleading because what we have for full-time minimum wage is actually two earners working 40 hours a week, 52 weeks a year. It assumes they don't get sick, they don't get injured, they don't take a vacation, and they're actually able to work 40 hours a week year-round. So again, you can see the vast disparity between the minimum wage floor that we have on wages, what it costs to support a family, and what the federal poverty level would identify as being either, quote, in poverty or not in poverty. I don't know how much time I have. Am I?
You got 15 minutes.
Well, I have just a little bit more. I'm not going to talk for 15 more minutes. I just want to talk very, very generally about the living wage because I think Don Grant's going to talk.
Total, 15 minutes total.
Yeah, a little bit. He'll talk in more detail. Yeah, what we need to understand is what, when we say we should have a living wage, what are we really talking about? Who is covered by that? What kinds of positions, and how would that be established? And most of the communities, there are about 140 municipalities in the United States that have established a living wage that is higher than the minimum wage. Generally, it covers contract employees. In some places, it will cover any kind of business that has been attracted because of economic development incentives or any other kind of contract relationship with the municipality where taxpayer dollars are paying somebody to do a service that the municipality would otherwise do. Denver, as an example, passed a living wage ordinance that covers parking lot attendants, outsourced parking lot attendants, security guards, childcare workers at any public building or public parking facility owned by the city, or clerical support workers. So you identify, mechanically, you identify who you want to cover. It could cover all outsourced jobs or just a subset of those. And then you establish what benchmark do you want to use to set that minimum wage. And again, the municipalities that have done it have taken many, many different approaches, but it's usually some kind of multiple of the federal poverty level. And generally, it's pegged to the FPL for a household of 4. I brought a chart. I'm sorry I didn't reproduce it for you, but they range, I think the date of this, maybe 2009, from a low in the city of Milwaukee of 83% of the federal poverty level for a family of 4 to Hartford, Connecticut, which pegged theirs at 194%. So, the local government, through some process, hopefully looking at the self-sufficiency standard, would identify some multiple at the federal poverty level and then use that to establish what the living wage is. Many places then will allow an offset, a credit, reduce that living wage requirement if they offer health care benefits, if they offer paid sick leave. So you can build in various incentives to enhance that package and actually provide a good job. So that's basically what we mean when we talk about a living wage. How is it different from simply establishing a higher minimum wage in the city of Boulder or in Boulder County? First of all, it's illegal right now under state law. But the minimum wage would apply to every employee in the jurisdiction. Living wages are much more targeted, and they apply to jobs that are paid for with taxpayer dollars. Many of the issues you get around job flight and reduction in employment levels and things like that that come up when you talk about a minimum wage generally don't apply to the living wage discussion, although Professor Zaks may disagree with me on that. Because these are companies that are coming to the city and saying, we would like to do business with you. We would like to take your taxpayer dollars and do a service for you. They can't really flee because this is where they want to do business. And then I'll just quickly run through a couple of the rationales for doing it. Basically, I think the one that is the most fundamental is that the local governments, when they contract for services, should be paying for good jobs. When you do we'll save money and contract out custodial services, it's a race to the bottom. And we have a double standard, essentially, where we no longer call these city employees, so we don't provide the basic wages and benefits that the city wants to provide its own employees. We contract it out and we say, well, never mind, we don't really care. I'm not saying you feel that way, Megan, but in effect, it's kind of closing your eyes to the impact of whatever taxpayer dollars you save by contracting out those services. It also, establishing a living wage is a community expression of the value of hard work. If you work full-time, doing a job that is essential to the city, you shouldn't be in poverty, period. And then the other main rationale of what people often point to is the fact that when businesses do benefit from local public funds, they should pay enough to keep that employee out of poverty. And I think that everybody in Boulder subscribes to that value, or I hope they do. So that's what I wanted to cover in my introduction to this issue, and I will now turn the microphone over to Professor Zaks, I assume.
I have 20 minutes, is that correct?
15.
15 minutes?
Do you want a mic?
No, thank you. 15, was that the original deal?
Original deal?
For the opening presentation. For the opening.
Good evening. It's a great pleasure to be here, a great honor. I've never spoken before an audience like this. I've never spoken in front of an audience like this before. And I'm very glad to have and challenged to have the opportunity. The issue we're talking about is a species of a much larger set of questions, which is how do we take instincts that are fundamentally humane and fundamentally admirable and translate them into policy that does not simply affirm the admirability of our instincts, but rather addresses the problems that we find ourselves engaged with. And it turns out that the economics of that make it much more challenging than we like to believe. So, why the living wage is a bad idea, and what would work better? First, we have two related problems. The first, some people have low standards of living. Unarguable, we've seen plenty of evidence of that already in the county of Boulder, in the state of Colorado, and it's perfectly reasonable to be concerned about that. Now, when we talk about the living wage, we're conflating that with the second problem, which is that some people are paid low wages. And fundamentally, the strategy that the living wage represents is to address the first problem by, in some sense, solving the second. The first problem with that is they're not the same problem. Those with low living standards, the majority of those with low living standards are not at work. If you change wages, you have no impact on what happens to them. Moreover, the majority of those with low wages excuse me, do not live in households with low living standards. Obvious examples of this are, for example, teenagers who have minimum wage jobs. And obviously that's not the part of the population that concerns us tonight. Nevertheless, statistically, when you look at those who have low wages, the majority do not live in households with low living standards. That means they actually don't have the problem that has brought us here tonight. So, if you manipulate wages to raise it for these workers, they already have the living standards you would like them to have. You're not solving the problem. On the contrary, you're conferring unnecessary benefits. So, the subset of people for whom it is, in some sense, reasonable to think about whether manipulating wages will address the question of their living standards is this relatively small group who have both low wages and low living standards. Now, so the living wage doesn't work for those with low wages and low standards of living. I'm sorry. And for that small subset, those who have low wages and a low standard of living, here are the problems with a living wage. First, it's not based on a coherent understanding of why wages are low. So, if your sense is that wages are low and you want to make them better, you need to begin with some understanding of why they're low. It's no different from having a doctor say to you, I don't know why you're sick, but I'm going to treat you anyhow. If the doctor said that, it would make you uneasy. The living wage policy is a prescription without a diagnosis, and we'll see more about that in a moment. Moreover, and this is more damaging, the living wage policy does not have a coherent story for how to sustain employment when wages are artificially increased. So, why are wages low? There's two possible reasons. One is employers ruthlessly exploit their employees. The other is that workers aren't skilled enough to do anything that is particularly valuable. Do employers ruthlessly exploit their employees? Let's ask, do we have any employers in the audience? Do you ruthlessly exploit your employees and pay them much less than they're worth? No, all right, so we have to look elsewhere for that. Does it happen? Maybe. It can't be common. And if it does happen, the first response should be to invoke the laws that are there to protect employees from specifically this kind of problem. If, on the other hand, low wages come from low skills, then we have to ask, how does the living wage affect that? The living wage is going to require employers to pay workers more than their work is worth. This kind of imbalance must have negative consequences. When you insist on valuing something at a level that is artificial, you are going to have results that you don't expect and that you aren't looking for. Here's what happens when employers are forced to pay wages that are too high. First, they reduce employment. Second, they look harder for higher skilled workers to do these jobs for which they are now forced to pay higher wages. Third, if there are other components of employee expenses, like, for example, fringe benefits, uniform allowances, cleaning the employee bathroom, if there's anything else the employer spends on having his workers, If you force the employer to pay higher wages, the employer is going to cut back on these other components, and it's not at all clear that you've made the worker better off on net. On top of that, employers will invest in technology so as to replace the low-skilled workers who are now being paid more than what their labor is worth. And lastly, they'll look to outsource to suppliers who are not bound by requirements that they overpay their workers. These are the things that are going to happen. These are the unavoidable responses that employers will invoke if you ask them to pay their workers more than their workers are worth. Now, these are going to sound familiar to many of you because they have appeared as points in the discussion over the minimum wage. And what do we know about empirically, how important they are? If we raise minimum wages, for example, do we reduce employment? Well, the answer seems to be yes, but not by very much. And I think that's been a surprise, it's certainly been a surprise to me and to most other people. The employment numbers don't seem to go down very much. And that might seem to say, why not raise the minimum wage? And why not raise the living wage? And the answer is because we don't know anything about the other four responses. So for example, we know that when minimum wages go up, the number of workers don't go down very much, but we don't know who those workers are. We like to believe that it's the same workers, but there's no guarantee of that. On the contrary, the expectation would be that many of those workers, after the minimum wage goes up, are higher skilled, and they've replaced the workers who previously had jobs before the minimum wage went up. Similarly, we don't know what employers have done to other components of employee compensation. We don't know what employers have done with regard to using technology to replace low-skilled jobs. And we don't know the extent to which increases in minimum wages induce employers to outsource labor to suppliers who aren't subject to these wages. We don't know any of these effects. And so the fact that the one effect we have measured, that the raw employment effects seem to be small, that can't be very comforting. Because even if the raw employment effects are small, there are lots of other bad things that can happen to low-skilled workers because their employers have been forced to pay them too much. And those bad things could very well be happening, are almost surely happening, and we haven't counted them. So, the great danger from these wage-setting policies is that they will hurt precisely those who are most vulnerable, the least skilled. When you ask an employer to pay more, the first person he's going to look to get rid of is the worker who has the least capacity. And that presumably is the one who has our greatest sympathy. Their jobs are most easily dispensed with, mechanized, outsourced, and their tasks are probably most susceptible to being reorganized and reassigned to higher skilled workers. So, summary, the practical effects of living wage policies: those with low living standards who are not at work, no effect. Those with low wages who actually live in households with high living standards, they receive unnecessary subsidies. That money is wasted from the point of view of the purpose that we're trying to achieve. Those with low wages in low living standard households, those who we actually want to help, they get a temporary income gain at the risk of a permanent employment loss. This, to me, looks like a bad deal. On top of that, I think the ethical context of living wage policies requires some examination. Again, the instinct behind these policies is admirable and humane, but the execution requires a little more thought. Why do workers have low skills? Well, there are a variety of reasons. Their endowments at birth may have been weak. Their family's origin may not have been in a position or may not have been predisposed to provide investment in skills or support investment in skills. Their communities may not have been in a position to provide the schooling that would have allowed people to invest in skills. And they themselves may have chosen not to invest. We see all sorts of combinations of all four. These are all reasons why workers might come to the workforce with low skills. What the living wage policy tells an employer is the following: we're worried about these workers because they aren't very productive. It's not your fault. You weren't there in their family of origin. You weren't there at their schools. You weren't there in any of those points in their lives when they were forming their skills. Nevertheless, you have to fix it. In other words, we're putting your money where our mouth is. Ethically, that seems like a compromised position. In personal life, public life and life in general, my experience is, have to be really thoughtful about aligning responsibility carefully. We may voluntarily choose to accept responsibility for problems that we did not create. And in fact, those are often the great moments in our lives and in our community lives. It's a very different thing to assign responsibility for a problem that they did not create to someone else for the purposes of having them solve it. That, as a practical matter, creates very problematic incentives. That is, in general, it creates lots of reasons for the recipient of that responsibility to find ways to shirk it. On top of it, it's a very thin virtue. Identifying a problem and then asking someone else to solve it, it's not the kind of thing that we take the greatest pride in. So, if you're going to advocate for a living wage, what burden must you bear in order to do so rigorously, analytically, successfully? First, the question of incidence. That is, who will get the benefits? Do the benefits of this policy actually accrue to the intended beneficiaries, those with low wage and low living standards? To what extent will they be wasted on those with low wages but in high living standard households? And third, why does this policy ignore the great numbers of people who have low living standards but are not at work and therefore won't benefit? Secondly, the burden that has to be borne has to do with the effectiveness of these policies. Why are wages low, and what will prevent employment losses if we artificially elevate them? What are the alternatives? Well, first, the question must be, where does the money come from? And then the question is, how do we disperse it? Where should the money come from? The concern about people with low standards of living is societal. And the sources of those low standards of living certainly are not specific to the employer. They must be thought of as more general as well. The failures to encourage skill accumulation are at least partially societal. That is, when people come to the labor force with inadequate skills, part of that at least is the failure of their schools and their communities to provide those schools. Society should pay. Raise taxes. If you want to find money to help people who don't have it, fine. Get that money, raise taxes. How do you give it out? Well, for those with living standards and low wages, we already have a way. The Earned Income Tax Credit. Now, let me step back for a moment. Giving stuff to people is always problematic because it changes their incentives. That is, when people know that they can get something from someone else, that reduces their incentive to provide it for themselves. You can't get away from that. That doesn't mean you don't give them anything, but it does mean you have to be careful about how you present it to them in order to try to minimize the negative incentive effects. The Earned Income Tax Credit does a pretty good job of that. Not perfect, there is no perfection, but it delivers the most to the poorest, and it minimizes the possible incentive distortions. So for those who are working, the right way to give them more an access to a higher standard of living is to raise taxes on those who can afford to pay so that we can increase the Earned Income Tax Credit and allows those who can't afford to pay to get more of a subsidy as a consequence of their labor. For those with low living standards who are not at work, there really isn't much choice. Direct assistance, right? Direct assistance. It's old, it's problematic. We've tried a variety, many different ways of doing it. We always run into challenges. I'm sorry, that's the nature of the beast. There's no way around those challenges. If people aren't at work and they don't have enough, the only way to provide it is to give it to them. Creates well-known incentive problems. They're unavoidable. But at least those problems are confined to the beneficiaries. That is, those who receive then have to ask themselves how hard they're going to work to provide for themselves. But with direct assistance, there are not incentive problems associated with the donors. Whereas with something like the living wage, when you tell the employer that he's got to provide that subsidy, then he immediately has an enormous incentive to try to avoid that. And so the incentive problems with the living wage are on the donor side as well as on the recipient side. Thank you for your attention.
How's that?
That's better.
Okay,
Yeah.
all right. As I was saying, I just want to thank the groups that put this event together, especially Shirley White for her special work on this. As indicated earlier, I teach and work in Boulder, which is a very prosperous city, but I also live in Lafayette, in a neighborhood where 96% of the kids attending school there get free lunches. So, I've observed some of these disparities that were alluded to earlier, and I deeply appreciate the fact that we have folks in our community who take these issues seriously. Take this off?
Take it off, turn it off.
Okay.
You don't get feedback. Okay.
All right, now we're ready. Okay. I think. Well, in the flyer that was put out earlier, it said that speakers will include those for and against a living wage. And the truth be told, I doubt that any one of us is opposed to people earning what your flyer says is a living wage. It is a wage to meet the basic needs to maintain a safe, decent standard of living within the community. I think we would all like to see that happen. We just perhaps disagree over just what local communities can and should do to help citizens earn such a wage. I also think each of us would agree that creating a community in which everyone can maintain a safe, decent standard of living is challenging. It does not lend itself to an easy policy solution. You know, it might be entertaining to have someone like myself come up here and adamantly defend a certain policy, and Jeff and I can go back and forth and so forth. But I believe folks who present the case in that way are being dishonest with themselves and with their audience. So, as one of the speakers who is supposed to represent the pro-living wage position, I want to confess from the outset that a living wage ordinance is an imperfect and incomplete solution to a city's employment problems. But it can be an important first step towards a more perfect and complete solution, in that it serves to raise awareness about the plight of low-wage workers and sets an example of what constitutes a good corporate citizen. And so what I'm going to do in the next few minutes is to share some of my past experiences with living wage campaigns and some of the lessons that I have learned along the way that a city like Boulder might want to consider as it thinks about how to address the situation of its low-wage workers. As alluded to earlier, I'm kind of new to Boulder. I moved to Boulder this January from Tucson, Arizona, where I taught for several years at the University of Arizona. And during my time in Tucson, I was asked by a community-based organization affiliated with the Industrial Areas Foundation if I would be a spokesperson for its living wage campaign. Now, a few months before this community-based organization approached me, another local group had tried to pass a minimum wage law at the city level. For reasons I won't go into, this group failed to persuade voters to pass a minimum wage law, but it did succeed in drawing attention to problems of poverty in Tucson. We learned, for instance, that nearly 1 of 5 residents in Tucson live beneath the federal poverty level. We also learned that some of these poor residents work for employers hired to do subcontract work for the city of Tucson and its surrounding county. Well, this raised some serious questions about the city and county government's commitment to addressing the problem of poverty. Many began to object about their tax dollars being used by local governments to essentially subsidize a poverty level existence through the outsourcing of various services to low-paying contractors. Well, in response to this outcry, the Industrial Areas Foundation organized a group of local churches, teacher associations, unions, nonprofits, and other concerned groups to persuade the city and county to pass a living wage ordinance. Now, because voters had just rejected a minimum wage law, one of the challenges this coalition faced was helping citizens to understand the difference between a minimum wage law and a living wage ordinance, because many citizens tended to confuse the two. For example, the chief opponents of the living wage ordinance in Tucson were local restaurant owners, who mistakenly thought that such a measure was the same as a minimum wage law. As the handout prepared by Mary Ann Elner that you have with you there suggests, a minimum wage law requires all employers, say in a city, to pay their workers at a certain wage rate. In contrast, a living wage ordinance only sets a wage rate for employers who receive government contracts, say from a city government. Also, unlike a minimum wage law that is mandatory, a living wage ordinance is voluntary in the sense that businesses are not required to bid on government contracts. Now, there are different ways to calculate a so-called living wage. As Claire was suggesting, typically wages are defined at a certain percentage of the federal poverty level. In Tucson, a living wage was defined as 125% of the federal poverty level, which worked out back in 2009 to be the equivalent of about $9 an hour. As others have suggested, and I'll discuss later, there are some problems with defining a living wage in that way. Now, one of the arguments that is frequently leveled against living wage ordinances, and I've heard this already, is that if you raise the amount of money that contractors must pay their lowest paid workers, well, what are they going to do? Well, they'll simply get rid of some of those workers or severely cut their hours. Some folks can completely dismiss this idea as if it can never happen. Others accept it without question, as if all contractors would respond in this way. The city of Tucson took a kind of middle ground approach that I think others might learn from. Rather than assuming all contractors will or will not respond to a living wage ordinance by laying off their workers or cutting back their hours, it sent out a survey to their existing contractors and asked them not only how many workers would have to have their wages raised to reach this living wage standard, but also how contractors would respond if they had to comply with this standard. Now, as you might expect, some said they had no choice but to get rid of some of their workers or cut back their hours if they had to pay them a living wage. Others, however, said they could avoid firing workers or cutting their hours by offsetting their wage increases through various cost-cutting measures. For example, contractors could save money by using air conditioning less often, or by replacing their workers' uniforms every year instead of every 6 months. Indeed, several of these high-road contractors supported a living wage ordinance because they thought it would allow them to compete with their less efficient low-road rivals. City officials who were supportive of a living wage ordinance obviously did not want any workers to be fired or have their hours cut back as a result of this measure. At the same time, they were heartened to discover that some contractors seemed able to absorb its extra costs. So what they did was to calculate how much money taxes they would have to raise to cover the cost of increasing the wages of those workers employed by the first group of low-road contractors, and then they calculated how much it would cost to hire someone to see that contractors complied with the ordinance by performing various periodic audits and other forms of monitoring. It turned out it would only cost about $2 per citizen to cover the cost of a living wage ordinance. That would mean that the contracts awarded by the city would be slightly bigger than in the past, but recipients of those awards would now be required to pay each of their employees a living wage. In light of this information, officials went on to approve living wage ordinances at the city and county levels. For those of us who had organized on behalf of these ordinances, it was very rewarding to know that we had improved the lives of those who served our city and county. Likewise, for those city and county officials who supported these measures, it was gratifying to be able to say that their local governments set an example of what constitutes a good corporate citizen. At the same time, we recognize that we have by no means cured all of Tucson's employment problems, even the problems of those faced who were covered by the ordinance. We knew, for instance, that although a living wage of $9 per hour would enable an individual to live a life of decency, a single parent with 2 children would have to be paid almost 3 times that amount to do so. As Claire was suggesting, some areas adjust their living wage rates for family size, others do not. Tucson did not. So in that sense, we kind of let some of those workers down. We also knew that living wage ordinances, and this is the point that Jeffrey was making, are not sufficiently targeted. That is, like a minimum wage law, they can benefit people whose families are not in poverty. A more effective strategy, as Jeff was suggesting, would be some type of earned income tax credit that would provide a benefit in the form of a tax break or refund to working people with low to moderate family incomes. Finally, we knew that while our living wage ordinances set an example for other cities and counties, $9 an hour would not be adequate even for single persons in locations like here with higher costs of living. So in light of these experiences and lessons, let me just conclude by offering these bits of advice. First of all, keep the conversation going. Tucson's living wage ordinance did not come into being overnight. It took months and months of studying, planning, and discussing the measure with various parties. Having public forums like this is great, but if we are to address the plight of low-wage workers, we must be careful not to limit our conversations about employment and wage issues to around Labor Day. Second, keep it real. Keep it real. It's flattering to know that you will listen to academics like myself and what I have to say about the working poor, but the real experts on the topic are the working poor themselves. To prevent this topic from becoming another airy abstraction, therefore, spend some time listening to the stories of workers. Stories of workers who have experienced what it's like to be denied a decent experience. Find out, for example, what it's like to live on a less than living wage and raise a family. Third, be willing to get your hands dirty. Rather than assuming all businesses respond to a living wage ordinance in the same way, groups need to perform the messy task of collecting data to determine whether that's actually the case. Fourth, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Experts will often try to discredit a particular policy by holding up another as the ideal. For example, in Tucson, some conservatives spoke of the virtues of an earned income tax credit, not because they wanted to expand it, but to beat back efforts to raise the minimum wage and adopt a living wage ordinance. While revealing the limitations of a particular policy is important, I do not think it is an excuse for doing nothing at all. Nor is it very helpful to discuss policies in either-or terms. A more constructive approach, I believe, is to discuss how different policies might complement one another, or how a good but limited policy might serve as a springboard to a more perfect and comprehensive one. Finally, get with the times and put your money where your mouth is. I know that Boulder takes great pride in being at the forefront of progressive causes. It's one of the reasons why I moved here. But when it comes to the living wage movement, it is unfortunately years behind. Since 1994, over 140 municipal governments have adopted a living wage ordinance. And so I would say to each of you here tonight that if you truly value the workers who serve this community, if you really believe they are entitled to a decent life, act on your principles by spending $2 to $3 on their behalf. It's the least you can do.